All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Akron Software Craftsmanship Meetup. We're a group based out of Akron, Ohio, with agnostic topics about software development and things relating to software development. We meet and have our events on the third Thursday of each month. Typically, we meet at the Akron Bounce Innovation Hub, which is a co-working space in Akron that I'm a big fan of. They have a great actual space and are full of nice people. Hopefully we can return there to have these in person in the next 2 or 3 months. More to come on that. My name is Mark Harwood. I work at Robert Half Technology. It's a big staffing firm. If you would like some assistance in finding a new opportunity, or you'd like some assistance in finding talented people to hire, please let me know. I'm very active on LinkedIn. You can search for me and chat with me there. What else? I'd say I'll be dropping links to the Cleveland and the Canton Tech Slacks. They're both public tech-oriented Slack channels where a bunch of awesome people can get together and talk about their tech tools of choice or their stack of choice. And I'm a big community guy, so I'll drop those links in the chat. And yeah, I want to introduce John Fox, who's our presenter tonight. He's a front-end engineer at a really cool company in Cleveland named Artemis Intelligence. He'll be talking to us tonight about component libraries. So John, I will hand it off to you.
Sure. So yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and we'll be talking a bit about component libraries, what I kind of refer to as the conduit between design and development. But first, I'll share a bit about myself. My name is Jonathan Fox. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm a senior UX engineer at Aperture. Mark mentioned I was a front-end developer, and that's how I started, but I've transitioned over to a UX engineer role, and I work at the intersection of design and development within the company. Aperture is a fully remote startup based out of Cleveland, or fully remote. But we're a distributed team making a web application that's focused on using data analytics to help investors find new opportunities. And we work with a lot of cool technologies like AI and NLP, distributed infrastructure. So if you're looking for a change, or if you're interested, you can always reach out to me afterwards. And as a UX engineer, a little bit about what I do is I work on what I call the front end of the front end, which is the HTML, CSS, and presentational JavaScript. And I work to basically ensure the scalable implementation of UX designs, as well as provide technical review and estimates of design intentions and things like that. I like to include a slide like this in any of my presentations, just in case there's any front-end engineers who are listening and are maybe feeling a bit unamused with the amount of application logic that's kind of found their way into our role, or maybe those front-end engineers who we're hoping to work a bit closer to the look and feel of a UI. If it sounds like you, I would also just, outside of this presentation, to check out the career path of UX engineering, which is kind of the opportunity to have design input and be close to design while still shipping code. So in this presentation, we'll just start by looking at the different perspective on what a component library is, just to make sure we're on the same page. And then we'll move on to the benefits of creating one for your project, as well as the pros and cons of adopting one of the many pre-made component libraries that are out there in lieu of creating your own. And then finally, before we end, we'll go over the general process on how to create a component library should you need to. This presentation is technology agnostic, and it's developer and designer friendly. So depending on who you want to share it with or who's here, you don't have to worry. There's no specific knowledge you need to come in with. So without further ado, let's talk about what is a component library. So component libraries, well, what I like to think of as a component library is a collection of pre-customized UI elements intended to simplify and guide design implementation. And I know that's kind of a loaded definition with a lot of things in it, so I thought it might help if we take a look at it from a few different perspectives. So from a design perspective, we can kind of think about component library as a collection of design elements translated to presentational code logic, and the code for things like text inputs, buttons, cards, charts, basically anything that is used to create a user interface and aggregation. If we look at it more from a DevOps perspective and zoom out, we can kind of view a component library as a standalone repository of customized DOM elements that can be consumed by other repositories as needed. So if a one-to-many relationship between a component library and multiple web applications is one of the typical environments you'll have by companies that choose to make a component library. But if we take a closer look from a developer perspective, someone who might be in the weeds of it, we can view a component library or as a component within a component library as just a function that returns a DOM element based off of a combination of instantiation variables and pre-customizations. And this is just about the only bit of code we'll see. But for those of you that are React developers who have seen a little bit of React, we can take a look under the hood of that previous diagram. And on the left, it's just a functional component and for a button, and it takes in a few instantiation props like size, type, and conditionally attaches some pre-made CSS class to the HTML button tag. And there's no application logic in it. You can see with the onClick method, it just passes in what is given to it as an instantiation prop. And if we look in the middle, you can kind of see in this example, hello world is the consuming application of the component library. So we have an import statement consuming it from our component library. And we have a real simple render where all we're doing is providing it with the input props we had before. And on the right side, you can see how that might render. So again, it's the component library, the component code is on the left. An example of it being imported and used by consuming application is in the middle, and then what the end user might see is on the very right. Why make a component library? So there's a number of reasons, but I've tried to simplify it into the most overarching big picture reasons why a company might choose to create one. And the first one is to ensure proper design implementation. In other words, making sure that a web application looks exactly like it was intended to, and not just kind of like it was intended to, which is usually what happens. And a component library can help you do that by setting a component level cadence for design review instead of a page level design review cadence, right? It gives designers a process and stakeholders a process to see what pieces of the UI look like instead of seeing what they look like at the very end, where it can be a bit overwhelming in terms of what needs to be corrected. It can also allow presentational code to be reviewed and perfected once and reused indefinitely. So if we think back to our example of the button component, that button component can be aesthetically reviewed by a design team once, and you know it's good and it meets the company standards and it can be used throughout. So it's a nice way of basically resting assured that your scalable user interfaces in the future are still up to design standards. And another kind of key aspect of this is by having a component library, it encourages a dedicated approach to UX engineering, which is a nice change from what usually happens. And what usually happens is if you don't have a component library, the HTML, the presentational JavaScript, and the CSS, right, it kind of gets merged in with front-end Jira tickets and front-end cards, and just very much becomes an afterthought, right? And a component library kind of gives that a home and dedicated room during sprint planning. So the second benefit of using a component library is they can significantly accelerate the prototyping process. And they can do that by preventing the entanglement of presentational application logic in the front end, which is always nice, as well as eliminate design decisions within the consuming code bases. So back on our button example, the only design decision that had to be made for that button were just a few pre-approved variables like size and type. and the implementing developer and the implementing or consuming code base didn't have to write any raw CSS. Naturally, when a component is already encapsulated, the cost of layout changes and new UI views based on these components is relatively low, as opposed to if they weren't encapsulated and they had to be rearranged. And the final benefit really is a little bit of a more interpersonal detail, but it's a component library can really help foster designer-developer relations. And they do that by creating a shared language for visual elements, as well as kind of an analogous workload between designers and developers. So what that basically means is if a designer wants to create a new component, that's actually a significant amount of work for the developer, which is, you know, a frequent occurrence and a frequent complaint from developers. But along with that, it's also a significant amount of work, or a non-trivial amount of work for the designer to do their share in creating a new component. So as a component, as a developer's workload increases on a component library, so does a designer. So it's kind of creates a relationship where both parties have respect for the other one's time and energy and expenditure. And of course, the final reason is when you have a dedicated UX engineering practice and you have a dedicated component library and, you know, all these things where the developer and the designer are putting work into it, it really kind of encourages a shared ownership over the delivered user experience, rather than it being something that the developer doesn't really care about or something that the designer doesn't really feel that good because their vision isn't realized. So let's talk a bit about pre-made component libraries. So component libraries are so great, right, that you frequently will get the question, why not just use one of the many open source ones? And if you've been around for any amount of time, you've probably seen a few of these, like Material UI, Ant UI, or Fluent UI. And they're basically just basically just component libraries, collections of UI elements that are available for immediate out-of-the-box implementation. They have flexible theming, an expansive selection of components, and the ability to adopt a component library without a dedicated UX designer and UX engineer, which is particularly of interest of projects that are a little bit more resource constrained. And to clarify, I don't actually think that component libraries and the pre-made component libraries are necessarily a bad thing. But I bring them up in this presentation because there are two important caveats to consider when you go to use something like Material UI or Ant Design. And the first is that choosing a pre-made component library implicitly chooses its corresponding design language. And I think that's something that is often overlooked. And if you don't know what a design language is you can kind of think about it as an opinionated set of design rules and best practices, almost like a designer equivalent to a code style guide. And every pre-made component library, every custom-made component library, it's tied to a design language. And I went ahead and mapped out the design languages that these popular open source component libraries are mapped to. And that's probably realistically, and these design languages, again, they're best practice guides and thought out, right? The Google's Material Design language, that's a well thought out design language, as is Ant Design's and Microsoft's Fluent Design. But they're also extremely constraining if you are in a company or working with a design team who is tasked with kind of creating a completely custom look and feel to a web application. And that's probably why, if you look around, you won't find any major software companies using an open source component library. And that's just because their customer facing software would look pretty generic, or end up looking a bit like Google or Microsoft if they did go with Material or Fluent or something like that, which is never a good thing if you're looking for brand identity or a competitor to those companies. The second caveat is an interesting one. And with component libraries, even though they don't quite allow for the level of freedom that most designers need from the pre-made options, they are made with enough flexibility, just enough flexibility to really confound the design implementation process. So they're not flexible enough for designers, and they're just a little bit too flexible to trust with a non-UX engineer developer. And we can kind of see that in action if we go back to our button component example, right? So this is actually from Aperture. This is a copy and paste of a simple button spec. And as you can see, there's pretty simple. There's a primary option and a secondary option, as well as small and large sizes for each. From an engineering perspective, it'd be a pretty easy task, right? 2 variables, size and type. But if we were to use the Material UI component library to kind of add this button, we would be looking at something like this. Because of Material UI's flexibility, you just have a ton of input props that have to be toggled for the button to render the way that we want. And if you think about it, each one of these input props is an opportunity for the implementation to go wrong, right? So we have things like disable elevation, disable focus ripple, things that we would never really even need to consider, and things that we don't ever really want to be an option. But because Material UI is designed to fit a wide variety of projects that might need one or more of these things, they are included. And so that can be a little bit overwhelming, and again, prone to implementation error, which goes against the whole focus of the component library if you think back to our definition of easing design implementation. So now if we keep this button component in mind, and again, we just need it to toggle size and type, we can kind of see what it would look like if we made this as a custom component. So here's the same rendered button. It looks the same as before. And you can see that we really only have a few props, right? We have type, which only accepts primary and secondary. And we can have a size, which only accepts small and large. And of course, the label for whatever we want it to say. And you can kind of see if you're an implementing developer, maybe you're not a UX engineer, maybe you're a front end guy or a full stack guy. Which documentation would you rather, read? Probably the latter, right? Less opportunity to go wrong, a little bit more clear. Okay, and kind of go into the last section of this presentation, I wanted to walk you guys through a very high level of how you might go about implementing your own custom component library should you decide that's the route you want to go. So in step one is going to be designing comprehensively. And that's always where it's going to start. It starts at the design level. And when I say to design comprehensively, that means within your organizations, your designers, first off, need to use software intended specifically for UX design. And that's things like Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch, and not things like Photoshop or Illustrator, not because those are bad tools, but because when you use a dedicated UX design tool, there's a lot of quantitative output that is kind of designed to parallel the development process that you just don't get with, I guess we'll say, generic graphic design tools. And as part of designing comprehensively, realistically, that means that you're going to need to hire or contract out a dedicated resource, right? There is a lot of iterative work, a lot of organizational work to this process that's really not fit to being a secondary task to maybe a graphic designer or a creative marketing team and things like that. It is very much involved process. And I shouldn't have to say it, but I will say it that if you want a component library, you as an organization really need to avoid designing in the browser, right? Because if you design in the browser, there's no specifications to engineer to, and you can't really engineer correctly if there's nothing that says it's correct. So step two in making a component library very generally is developing an isolation. So your component library needs to be in its own repository, not only to make it independently distributable across a multitude of applications, but to also give it that footprint and respect in things like sprint planning and development practices and all the other things that really come along with respecting something as its own individual code base. And you'll also want to utilize a component development environment, something like Storybook or Style Guide, which is a tool that's extremely helpful in letting you view a component you're developing without necessarily importing it into a consuming application. And you're probably going to want to avoid application logic and opinions simply because if you do include application logic in your button, for example, you're going to limit the use cases that it can be used for, as well as make it prone to deprecation when the application logic changes. And then finally, in an ideal world, right, if you are on a team that's lucky enough to have the resources, you're really going to want to separate UX engineering and front-end engineering into separate roles. Similar to UX design, proper UX engineering is a job in itself when you start worrying about things like scalability, performance, accessibility, and getting a design exactly right. You really don't want that to be on someone else's plate that's also responsible for the application logic. Step 3 is packaging and delivering your component library, which can be done with tools like bit.dev or npm.js. You'll of course want to maintain semantic versioning for minor updates, major updates, and patches, because the whole point of this is to be able to add your component library as a package dependency to consuming applications. So in conclusion, I've made a quick list of tools I've mentioned throughout, just in case it's something you're interested in. All these tools have their own documentation and kind of help point you further down the rabbit hole. But for isolated development, we have Storybook and React Style Guidist, package distribution, something like bit.dev or npm, and of course UX design. There's Figma and Adobe XD that I can recommend. So that's all I have for you guys today. Any questions?
Yeah, I can kick us off with questions. John, when would you even start to develop or build a component library? Like, does it have to be before product development starts, or like before any of your screens, basically any of your UX starts being built? Or can you start building things out from an MVP standpoint and then retrofit a component library onto it? How does that work?
Sure. Are you talking from building it in terms of a design or engineering?
Well, so it just seems to me like this would have to be something that would be done prior to the development of the product. You know what I mean? So I'm just wondering, like, does it have to be like, do you need to have your component library set before you start actually developing your web app or your mobile app or something like that?
No, and it's the right way to do it, of course, and it's always easier to start greenfield than to retrofit a project. But just about every company or everyone I've talked to that's using a component library is doing it because they learned the hard way and they realized after they didn't have one that they needed one. And so realistically, if you have a working MVP or you have, let's just say the classic monolithic React app repository, right? It has your application logic, your presentational logic, and everything in between. The process of that, converting that to component libraries, one, making sure you like the way the design looks. And if you do, and it looks the right way, it's just not organized into a component library. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go into that code base, whether it's React or Angular, and you're going to have to strip out that presentational logic one piece at a time.
Okay, that makes sense. And that's what I was expecting.
But the good news is with the second repository is you can build that component library and still be preserving the app that's consuming it, right? You can wait until the consuming library or the component library is completely finished before you tear out the non-component library components in the application.
Cool, thank you.
Hey, John, what size of organization or development team or something like that do you think it's most applicable for? Do you think it can apply from small teams, or do you think there's a certain kind of size where, it becomes more necessary or more beneficial?
Sure. I would say at Aperture, we're a pretty small team. We're only a development team of 5 or 6, but really the only factors that make it applicable. One, do you care how your application looks? Do you really care about how your application looks, or do you only kind of care? And I think there's a lot of businesses out there that, right, they care that it looks good, but they're not overly specific about how it looks. And if that's the nature of your company, you probably don't need a component library because you don't really need intentional UX engineering. If you do really care about how it looks and it's really important and things like that, it's a priority, then all you really need is a team that's big enough or resources that are enough to handle hire a dedicated UX engineer on top of a front-end engineer, right? You need a dedicated resource to really handle your UX engineering for this to work. But beyond that, any size team could work.
Thank you.
John, you mentioned component libraries for like React and Vue separately, if I understood correctly. Do you have like a preference for either which you prefer to work with, or in general, kind of what you recommend is like just best practices overall?
React versus Vue.
Yes.
Well, a lot of it's going to depend on your consuming application, right? So if your consuming application is written in React, you're probably going to want it consuming a React component library, and vice versa for Vue. On a personal preference, though, it doesn't really matter, because if you start looking from a presentational point of view, a lot of the magic that React and Vue do isn't really that impressive on an HTML and CSS level. So you're really only working with the presentational code, whether it's JSX, HTML, CSS, and a little bit of interactive JavaScript. So it's really hard to give one much of an advantage over the other. And I would say let the consuming application kind of drive what you're going to use.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
John, this might be a bit of a silly question, but I'm trying to think as much as I can about the branding of the different apps that like service style apps that I use somewhat regularly. And although I haven't used Uber in forever, I did think of like Uber and that app and using that app and the branding on that app and the UX of that app versus like Uber Eats, which is, it looks slightly different. So would it be safe to assume that with a component library, if your company has app number 1 and then you're launching into this new area and you need to do app number 2, that forking your component library to cover, like, you get the same look and feel of the product that everyone knows you for, but now this is your new product, so it's going to feel slightly different? Or is forking component libraries a thing just to establish like a different brand but still under the same umbrella of the main brand?
You could do that. So you kind of have two options, right? Because when you're forking, you're essentially creating its own component library based on the original one, but still kind of its different component library. You could do that. I think it's a little bit less common to want two of the same applications to look different, or two applications under your brand to look different. I think more common use cases, you want them to be in line with each other. But if you did want them to look different, you could fork it. Or what you could do instead is that each of your components could have some level of variance. So if we go back to our button example, right? Where is that at? So if we go back to our button, here it is. Go back to our button example, right, where we have we have a type and we apply the primary, secondary class. Maybe in this case, there could be an Uber Eats class or a classic Uber class, right? That the implementation of it could look like button, and one of the props could be app type or something like that. Obviously, that's probably a pretty simplistic overview with something as complex as Uber, but really kind of a key thing to getting good at making component libraries is allowing enough variance so that you only need one button component to cover a wide variety of use cases.
Okay, that oversimplification worked wonders for me. So I totally get that, and why you would do that as opposed to build like, even forking a component library, because the main component library for the company and the branding is just going to cover the multiple services that they could offer.
Right. And there, let me see, maybe the design spec will help more. Now, there is, a little bit of an art to it rather than a science, right? Because for these cases, right, where we need a large, a small, and a primary and a secondary button, that's pretty manageable to do, and you can still have pretty legible code. But every once in a while, components, even if they're based on the same DOM element or both called buttons, every once in a while they can deviate far enough from each other that you might actually want them in different components just for code maintenance and things like that.
Question about like the possibility of combining pre-made and custom. So, let's say that you don't have the resources to have dedicated UX designers or engineers, and so you could benefit from a pre-made library, but you don't want the complexity that you talked about of options, or you don't want, or maybe there's things that your app needs that isn't handled by those pre-made libraries. like with React, that's what I'm most familiar with. I could see maybe, wrapping pre-made components yourself to limit, the options or to provide additional options. Does that seem feasible?
Yeah, you can do kind of what I call prop limiting, right, in React, where you can basically kind of have a button component that maybe wraps around the material button component, like you said, but it only takes in the pragmatic props, and those higher level props from the wrap component is the only thing that the implementing developer has access to. So that's definitely possible, and that would probably resolve this caveat, right? The confounding flexibility. Again, you'd still have to worry about the first one, which is being okay with its corresponding design language, right? Because if let's say you want to use the button in the text input of material UI, but you want to make everything else, right? Well, if you want everything to match, right, the custom things you make are probably just going to have to adhere to that material design language that your button and input are using. But you are correct with your assumption that you could alleviate some of this mess.
Okay. And then a sort of a process related question, like in terms of a development process like Scrum, are the UX designers and engineers part of the development team? Do they have separate stories, or are they collaborating? Like you have a user story that says, I want, a new interaction, and, part of it involves some new UI as well as some new functionality. Would you recommend breaking that up into a UX story and a functionality story, or any thoughts on that kind of?
Yeah, definitely. So when I have issues or when a designer approaches me with a problem related to, let's say, a button component, maybe the elevation is wrong or maybe the drop shadow is wrong, I do have them submit their concerns in the form of a Jira ticket. But at the same time, we do have a dedicated Jira epic to our component library, which is the epic where application logic bugs would go in. And, since it's usually designers submitting them, sometimes it can be a little unsure, right? They might think that something is a bug with the button component library, or something's not working with the component, but it's really an application logic thing. So there's a little bit of grooming that you kind of got to do as their developer counterpart to make sure things end up in the right place. But I do think that design concerns related to a component library should be surfaced into Jira. We don't have the designers as part of our development team. Usually what happens is I will be in our developer stand-up, and then I will have a meeting with the design team after that. Just to, they don't care about 90% of the stuff developers are talking about, and vice versa. So it saves them a little bit of time.
And if it's like a new component that's needed, the development team can proceed with a placeholder or something while the design team works on the component library aspect. Yeah,
it's possible to do that. But usually what happens though is, in my experience, is the presentational logic moves quicker than the application logic. So usually by the time a new feature, let's say there's a new feature, right, where there's a new kind of button that does some sort of new application logic, usually that button's going to be ready before that application logic is ready for PR. But to your point, there's nothing wrong with using just raw HTML DOM elements as placeholders in the meantime.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
John, another simpleton newbie question. When you're making a component library, if you were to divide it up, what percentage of that is the graphic design that you need to do behind making, like how everything is going to look versus writing the code for the different components?
Sure, and that's what's interesting is there's a significant amount of UX design work, right? So if you think about a button component, most people, if you're just, let's say you're a graphic designer tasked with designing a button component, your inclination, if you don't know the UX design process, might just be to make a button and maybe a small button and maybe the large button, just kind of this left column here. But there's a lot more that goes into it, right? There's accounting for hover states, disabled states, the states when text is extra long, text variations when text on the button is extra short. And so there is a non-trivial amount of organizational and technical work to the design process. So I would say it's probably about 30%, 30-70. So, which is, different than the kind of 90-10 that we're accustomed with, right? Quick to design, hard to implement. But when it comes to designing a component, I would say that at least 30% of the total hours spent will be designing it correctly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Especially if you consider the fact that design goes first, right? So the designers inherently are responsible for stakeholder sign off, and a button is given to me to develop. I know it's agreed upon by all the powers that need to agree on it.
There was another question in the chat, not required question, or if this is out of scope or not relevant to the group, but I'm curious how this fits with Sitecore. And I can broaden that out. I guess could you build a component library and then integrate it with an out of the box CRM, I guess? Have you heard of that, or is that a broad enough question?
Sure. So really, if you really just, let's go back to our coding example, right? So if you peel this back, right, this obviously has a bit of React magic and a bit of React syntax, but all this really is it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So my answer to that is if that CRM can handle a JavaScript function that outputs a DOM element, then yeah, there's no reason, right? It's totally, this approach, even though this example is in React, it's technologically agnostic, right? All DOMs read are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript when you're displaying a component. And if your CRM or environment is prepared to handle those things injected into it, then I don't see why not.
That's actually sort of what I expected. Matt does, and I should have said CMS. Sitecore is a big enterprise CMS. Can you build different single page apps, or can you use different frameworks and libraries for single page apps on top of Sitecore? I think you can.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not that familiar, but I was working with a client last week, and they were pretty heavy into partnering with Sitecore for their work that they were doing. And that's kind of where that question came from. It was just it looks like a big content management system, I think based off the Microsoft stack, so a lot of .NET stuff. But I think what Jonathan spoke to answered the question, that it would easily align with that.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks.
Of course.
Are accessibility concerns generally baked into pre-made component libraries, and would that be something that you would sort of keep within a custom component library as well?
Yeah, definitely, especially to what standard you're going to hold yourself to, right? Obviously, some of that is up to when you're making it custom, that's kind of up to you. And with pre-made component libraries, it's kind of up to them to include that. But I know that Material UI is AY 11 compliant, which is really nice. I can't speak to firsthand for the others, but wouldn't surprise me. The good thing is, though, is when you're developing a custom component library, there are tools like linting tools now that specialize in catching accessibility issues, whether that be things like missing props like tab index, or not having on-click handlers, or not having alt text, things like that. There are some automated linting tools that really come in handy for that kind of thing, because obviously accessibility is pretty important.
All right. Any other questions from anyone?
I have one for after the recording.
Okay.
Off the record.
Well, with that being said, John, I would like to say thank you so much for presenting. This was really cool, and I always try to get as many UX, kind of veer into the realm of UX style talks and presentations as I can each year. So thank you for helping me do that. And thank you for helping me think about more advanced UX topics than what I'm typically thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So I appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, really well done. I thought it was informative and good. I like the question section a lot.
All right. We will see everyone next month.